Furiosa! Furiosa!
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Colton, Ogburn, and Furiosa, Mad Max Saga was an epic prequel tale of the Imperator Furiosa, showing us her life in the Wasteland prior to the events of Mad Max Fury Road. So we're going to break down this movie for you guys, and we'll explain how it sets up the upcoming Fury Road sequel, Mad Max The Wasteland. We'll also explain the deeper meaning behind Dementus' gruesome fate, and how this film's special cameo and post-credit scene hint at what is next for Furiosa. And hey, before we get rolling, I want to share with you guys our Furiosa-inspired We Can Do It shirt featuring a parody of Rosie the Riveter with a mechanical arm, as well as our Thoriosa shirt featuring an iconic character on a motorcycle chariot going down the Bifrost Rainbow Bridge. Shopping our merch store is the best way to support our channel so that we can keep making videos just like this one. Thank you so much for your support. So the film opens with sounds from before the world fell. We hear 911 calls and voices on the radio. Now, in the original Mad Max movie, we learn about the fall of society and a war over resources. And in Fury Road, we hear Max explain how the world fell and how the Wasteland came to be.
As the world fell, each of us in our own way was broken.
And I'm glad they took the time in the opening seconds of this film to remind us that this dystopian wasteland was once occupied by Western culture. I mean, even the first Mad Max film had remnants of society that were still largely at work, such as Max being an officer who patrolled the wasteland. But in that film and its two sequels, we saw how the wasteland became more and more apocalyptic. And in turn, the survivors devolved further and further from the societal structures from before. Like Furiosa, Max was robbed of his family and sent down a path of revenge.
I'll say the names, and you say yes or no.
Now, I tell you this because the parallel between Max and the Wasteland in comparison to those who've gone bad is a crucial theme to this saga. In this movie, Furiosa, we see the same parallel between Furiosa and the Wasteland as we saw between the Wasteland and Max in the original trilogy as well as in Fury Road. We get to watch Furiosa be drained of her hope and her wonder, and we see the creation of the hardened warrior that we met in Fury Road. And in order for Furiosa to become a Wasteland savior like Max, she was destined to be broken and ripped away from her sheltered life so that she may shelter others in the future.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Now, this film gave us an origin story for Furiosa that was very similar to that of Max Rockatansky.
Rockawatsi?
That's his last name.
Huh, I thought his last name was Max and his first name was Mad. I mean, that's what the title says. What kind of name is Rockstansky anyways? Is that a Slavic name? And if so, where is he from? Belarus? Poland? Czechoslovakia? Well, actually, that'd be either Czech Republic or Slovakia now, because back in 1993, the country was split into...
So we get to see Furiosa come from a place of abundant resources and peace, and then she is dragged into the wild of the desolate wasteland. We got to see how the wasteland attempts to break her the same way it did Max, but these two characters prove that they cannot be broken, and the two become the strongest willed warriors of the wasteland, and together they carry the torch of the world that once was. Now, in the opening narration of this movie, we hear the words, "We are Half-Life." Now, the term Half-Life is often attributed to the War Boys in Fury Road, the servants of Immortan Joe, but it can also apply to any and all of those in the wasteland suffering from disease and mutation, and those who are destined to die early. But this theme of half-life not only applies to those with physical impairments, but to those with broken souls like that of Furiosa as well. Souls that are set on revenge. In the first Mad Max film, we see Max set on a path of revenge to avenge the murder of his wife and child, but in subsequent films, Max is put in situations where he becomes a liberator for those in need. In this film, we see Furiosa on her path of revenge, but come the end of the film, we see her set on her path of liberation when she frees the slave wives of Immortan Joe and eventually goes on to meet Max in Fury Road. And those two liberators then fight together to free the entire Citadel from the tyrannical rule of Immortan Joe. But before we get too deep into that, I do want to take a second to talk about where Furiosa comes from, the Green Place, a green garden in the wasteland reminiscent of the Bible's Garden of Eden. In Furiosa, we see a young Furiosa and her sister Valkyrie exploring the woods of the Green Place. Now, in the Judeo-Christian mythology, we see Eve fall victim to the temptation and pick fruit from the forbidden tree. And picking from this tree is what brings sin into the world and is why Eve is ultimately cast out of the Garden of Eden. This is paralleled here with Furiosa when her sister insists that they go back home, but Furiosa stays just a little longer so that she can pick this piece of fruit.
Furiosa! We've come too far.
But shortly thereafter, Furiosa's curious and rebellious nature is punished by the sin of the Wasteland, and she is taken from the garden and ousted to the Wasteland, never to return. I also thought it was interesting that her sister was named Valkyrie. In Norse mythology, the Valkyrie are a group of women warriors who fight side by side with Odin at Ragnarok, Ragnarok being the apocalypse. The Mad Max franchise has many references to Norse mythology, such as the Immortan Joe's promise of Valhalla.
And I myself will carry you to the gates of Valhalla.
Yeah, and Thor is in the movie too.
Right? Yeah, so the Vovolini, they are a perfect representation of the Valkyrie, a strong female army who led a war against the apocalypse. In Norse mythology, or hey, even like we saw in Thor Ragnarok, many Valkyrie are destined to die, and that's what we see happen with the Vovolini in Fury Road. So, speaking of Fury Road, spoiler warning, I guess, if you haven't seen that, even though they show like the whole movie in a montage sequence of the credits of this movie, but I digress. So, in Furiosa, to defeat Immortan Joe, we see Furiosa attach a harpoon chain to Joe's face mask, and she then throws the chain around the spinning wheel of his car, and that rips off Immortan Joe's face.
His face?
So I thought it was a nice touch that we see young Furiosa do something similar to her captor when she arrives at the camp of Dementus, and then again later in the movie when she takes down the parachute attackers. Both instances involve Furiosa wrapping a chain around a spinny thing to pull someone to their death. And later in the movie, it's actually that same harpoon that we see used to defeat the parachute attacker. Now, this all is foreshadowing Furiosa's ability to reel in those who stand in her way. So now let's talk Dementus.
Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines.
So when we meet Dementus, we see him wearing a white cloak. This is meant to represent the small bit of morality that still exists within this character. A character who, like Max and Furiosa, has also lost his family and been beaten down by the Wasteland. We see that Dementus is slowly losing himself and his humanity. There's even a line in the film where the character known as the History Man has to explain to Dementus what the human tier is. This perfectly represents how Dementus and his followers are getting further and further from humanity and leaving things like emotion and a care for one another in the past. Now, this History Man serves as Dementus's connection to that old world. He even has words tattooed on his skin, almost as if he is becoming a living history book. A history book that will be abandoned and not learned from when Dementus starts his war with Immortan Joe. And look, Dementus wasn't a good guy when he came in contact with Furiosa for the first time. Far from it, in fact. But he was somewhat protective of Furiosa, and he didn't take advantage of her like some of the other less savory types within his crew might have done, likely because he too once had a daughter, and his daughter's teddy bear, like the white cloak, represent Dementus's fleeting humanity. But it's when Dementus is baptized in the red mist of the Immortan Joe that his remaining humanity is washed away. When he encounters the Immortan Joe and sees how the war boys are willing to sacrifice their lives for him without question, Dementus realizes that in order to be a true conqueror, he must become even more cruel and lose any and all respect for his own people. That's why when Dementus and his group devise a plan to take down Gastown, we see Dementus start sacrificing his own men and shooting them dead to make their scheme believable. And who are his men disguised as when he does this? War boys. Dementus has developed a taste for the power of Immortan Joe and a desire to have his own cult following that does his bidding without question, just like Immortan Joe. And the red mist that we see fall upon him at the Citadel represents this transition. No longer is the cape white, but it's now red, like the cape of a Roman Empire general. And of course, he has his chariot, which is also symbolic of the Roman Empire.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire?
All the time. His cape now being red also represents how he has blood on his hands, but he is not interested in washing it away because he realizes that in order to get where he wants to be, he is going to have blood on his hands at all times. It's also after Furiosa makes clear that she is not Dementus's daughter that Dementus is pushed further into letting go of the old world. His daughter was one of the only things keeping him somewhat connected, but Furiosa's rebuke severed that final tie he had to the old world and reminded him that his old self was gone. And this is when he agreed to hand Furiosa over to Immortan Joe to serve as one of his wives, despite having protected her earlier in the film. This severing from the old world is shown to us again when Dementus takes over Gastown and we see this Renaissance painting being destroyed. The former ruler of Gastown had been working on recreating this painting, showing us that he, like many others, still had somewhat of a connection to the old world. But Dementus's disregard of the painting shows us yet again that he has moved on and fully embraced the Wasteland. Now, speaking of that red mist that coated Dementus and set him on his path of no redemption, we also see a green mist do the same for Furiosa. We see Jack shoot into the sky this green mist canister, and when Furiosa sees it, she is reminded of her home, the Green Place. But instead of going home to the Green Place, she is determined to still defeat Dementus. This abandonment of returning home and turning her back on the green mist is symbolic of Furiosa's disconnection from that old world. This is shown to us again when she cuts off her arm to escape back to the Citadel, the same arm that contained her map that led back home. Next comes the 40-day war between Dementus's group and the Citadel, and Ryan pointed out that they're calling it the 40-day war doesn't necessarily mean that it lasted 40 days. It's essentially a biblical term for no one really knows. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that a lot of this saga is told as legend or mythology. I mean, the Mad Max stories have always been told like myths. Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, is narrated by someone who sees Max as this mythological legend, and the stories themselves aren't coming from a reliable narrator. It's almost as if these movies are meant to be viewed as individual tales of the Wasteland that may not necessarily line up perfectly with one another, and that could be the key to linking the original trilogy of films with Fury Road and Furiosa. These are all legends being told by different storytellers recounting events that have been passed down through generations. We get a perfect example of this with the many deaths of Dementus and what it is told that the fifth rider of the apocalypse, Furiosa, did to defeat him. This shows us that there are various takes on the legend of Furiosa, and how she is called the fifth rider of the apocalypse because she is what came after. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are what come before and destroy the world, but the fifth rider is a spirit of vengeance. She is the soul of the Wasteland, a soul torn between the old world and the new. And of course, Furiosa's iconic line, "Remember me," drives home this point that she is destined to become a Wasteland legend. She is destined to be remembered. When she defeats Immortan Joe in Fury Road, she says, "Remember me." And here in Furiosa, when capturing Dementus, she says, "Remember me," but as a question.
Remember me.
Now, literally speaking, she is asking if Dementus knows who she is, but thematically, we are meant to view this as the first step of her becoming a legend. And in Fury Road, when she tells Immortan Joe to remember her, the line also serves as a parallel to his War Boys' "Witness Me" line that they cry out before giving their life. Witness me! Witness! Witness! This signifies how she is now done giving her life to Immortan Joe, and how her taking over the Citadel is her reviving the Green Place. And hey, just a reminder, our Remember Me shirt is up on the store right now, ScreenCrushmerch.com. So Furiosa and her actions are destined to be remembered and reverberate throughout the Wasteland for generations, just like the stories of Mad Max. Like I said earlier, these two are the Wasteland's liberators. They are the soul of the Wasteland. So now let's talk real quick about what exactly happened to Dementus there at the end, and how it too ties to mythology, Greek mythology to be exact. This tree growing through the middle of a locked away Dementus is very reminiscent of the character Prometheus. Prometheus was punished by Zeus for giving man fire. He was bound to a rock, and eagles would come daily to eat his liver. Overnight, his liver would grow back, and then birds would return the next day to eat it again. This is paralleled in Furiosa when they eat from the tree that is growing through the middle of Dementus. Now, Dementus, like Prometheus, rivaled the king of the Wasteland, Immortan Joe, and like how Prometheus brought fire to man, Dementus brought the spark of rebellion against the Citadel. He even promised water for all, and we know from Fury Road that Immortan Joe uses water to control his subjects. Now, I'm not saying Dementus was a good guy and wouldn't have become just like Immortan Joe in the long run, but I'm more so focusing on the fact that Furiosa is doing the bidding of Immortan Joe, who in this analogy would be Zeus. She has bound Dementus to a rock to be pecked at for years to come as punishment for disobeying the God King. But of course, Furiosa does have her own reasons for doing this: revenge. The fruits of this tree are being born of revenge, and they symbolize the fact that Furiosa sold her soul to the devil of the Wasteland. But as we will find out years later in Fury Road, Furiosa will realize that Joe is just as bad, if not worse, than Dementus, and she will challenge his rule as well, and together her and Max will liberate the Wasteland.
It's Immortan Joe.
So speaking of Max, let's talk about that Max cameo. We saw Max and his ride on this mountaintop, and he was actually being played by Tom Hardy's stunt double. In an interview with George Miller, he was asked,
whenever you are telling a story within Max's world, could you tell me where Max is?
Yes, because we can't tell the stories otherwise.
So the return of Tom Hardy as Mad Max is something I'd really like to see. Charlize Theron back as Furiosa too. And maybe we could even get flashback sequences in that film so that we can still have Anya Taylor-Joy play Furiosa. And last but not least, let's talk about that post-credit scene where we see the bobblehead skull that belonged to the war boy Nux. So could this be a tease that Nux survived his sacrifice at the end of Fury Road? Or could it be teasing that Max, out of respect for Nux, recovered the bobblehead and has placed it on his dash? I personally cannot wait to find out, and I can't wait for what's next in this Mad Max saga. So guys, let me know, did you enjoy Furiosa? Does it hold up to Mad Max Fury Road? I think so, and I'd like to hear what you think down in the comments below, or you can @me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, be sure to subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Colton Ogburn.